Sometimes a mother reaches the end of her rope with a child she can't save. Sometimes that same child finds salvation in the most unexpected place, when 16-year-old Eli's mother trades him to the mountain woman for 2 goats and a sack of grain. Everyone expects the boy to be worked half to death. Remy Cade has a reputation in these parts. They say she's harder than winter and twice as unforgiving. The desperate mother figures if anyone can straighten out her troublesome son, it's the woman who lives alone in the mountains, like some kind of ghost. But Remy sees something in this broken boy that nobody else does. Instead of breaking him down with hard labor, she teaches him to hunt, to track, to survive. She shows him the old ways her grandmother taught her. What happens when the mountain woman's shocking plans aren't what anyone expected? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The dust cloud from Martha Hendrick's pickup truck was still settling when Remy Cade heard the boy's stomach growl. She'd been watching from her cabin window as the woman yanked her son from the passenger seat like he was a sack of feed, all sharp elbows and defiance. The boy, Eli, his mother had called him, stood there in clothes that hung off his frame like they belonged to someone twice his size. 2 goats and a sack of grain, Martha had said, not bothering with pleasantries. That's the deal. You teach him something useful or break him trying. I don't much care which. Now, 20 minutes after his mother had driven away, without so much as a backward glance, Eli stood in the middle of Remy's one-room cabin, looking like a cornered animal. His dark hair fell across his eyes, but she could see enough to know he was fighting back tears. Pride, maybe. Or just pure stubbornness. Remy set down her coffee cup and studied him properly. 16 years old, according to his mother, though he looked younger. Too thin, too pale, with the hollow-eyed look of someone who'd been hungry more often than not. His clothes were clean enough, but patched in too many places. Hand-me-downs, probably. The kind of boy who'd learned early that the world didn't owe him anything. You hungry? She asked. Eli's shoulders tensed. I'm fine. That wasn't what I asked. She moved to the small kitchen area, her bare feet silent on the worn wooden floors. The cabin was simple. One large room that served as living space, kitchen and bedroom, with a stone fireplace that she'd built herself 15 years ago when she first came to this mountain. A ladder led to a sleeping loft under the pitched roof. Everything was functional, built to last, with no decoration except for a hand-carved wooden chess set that sat on a small table near the window. Sit, she said, nodding toward one of 2 mismatched chairs at her kitchen table. Eli didn't move. Look, Remy, what? My name is Remy, not lady, not ma'am. Just Remy. She pulled a cast-iron pan from a hook on the wall. And you're going to sit down and eat something before you fall over. There was something in her tone, not harsh, but absolutely certain, that made Eli's defiance waver. He slumped into the chair like a puppet with cut strings, his eyes darting around the cabin, as if cataloguing escape routes. Remy cracked 3 eggs into the pan, the sizzle filling the silence. Outside, the wind moved through the pine trees with a sound like rushing water. It was early September, and the nights were already getting cold up here at 7,000 feet. Winter came hard and fast in the Rockies, and it didn't care whether you were ready for it or not. Your mother say why she brought you here? Remy asked, not turning around. Eli's laugh was bitter. Said you'd straighten me out, make a man of me. All that crap. And what do you think about that? I think she got tired of dealing with me and found someone else to dump the problem on. Remy flipped the eggs with practiced ease. There was truth in what he said, but it wasn't the whole truth. She'd seen the desperation in Martha Hendrick's eyes, the way her hands shook when she thought no one was looking. The woman was at the end of her rope, all right, but there was love there too. Buried deep, maybe, under layers of frustration and exhaustion, but love nonetheless. She mentioned your father? Remy asked. Eli's face closed off completely. Don't have one. Everyone has a father. Mine's dead. The eggs were done. Remy slid them onto a plate, added 2 thick slices of bread she'd baked that morning, and set it in front of Eli. his eyes fixed on the food with an intensity that told her everything she needed to know about how often he'd been eating lately. "Go on," she said. "It won't bite you." Eli picked up the fork like it might explode, then took a cautious bite. His eyes closed briefly, and when he opened them again, some of the hardness had gone out of them. He ate quickly, efficiently, the way someone eats when they're not sure when the next meal might come. Remy poured herself another cup of coffee and sat across from him. Through the window, she could see the peaks of the Continental Divide rising like ancient monuments against the sky. She'd chosen this place for its isolation, for the way it demanded respect from anyone fool enough to try to tame it. 15 years she'd been here, and the mountains still surprised her. "You ever been this far from town?" she asked. Eli shook his head, not looking up from his plate. "It's different up here, quieter, but not easier." She got up and moved to a wooden trunk near the fireplace, lifting the lid to reveal carefully organized supplies. Blankets, tools, preserved food, medicine, everything needed to survive when the nearest neighbor was 10 miles away and the nearest town was 30. At the bottom of the trunk, wrapped in oiled cloth, was her grandmother's chess set. Remy unwrapped it slowly, running her fingers over the hand-carved pieces. The wood had been polished smooth by decades of handling, each figure distinct and perfect. Her grandmother had taught her to play when she was barely old enough to hold the pieces, and later, when the world had gotten complicated and painful. The game had been one of the few things that made sense. "You play?" she asked, setting the board on the small table. Eli looked up from his empty plate, suspicion flickering in his eyes. "Why?" "Because I'm curious whether you've got a brain in that head of yours, or if it's all attitude and empty space." For the first time since his mother had driven away, Eli almost smiled. "Almost. I know how the pieces move. That's not the same thing as knowing how to play." She arranged the pieces with careful precision, whites facing Eli, blacks toward herself. The familiar ritual was soothing, like meditation, each piece in its proper place, the board balanced and waiting. "Your move," she said. Eli stared at the board for a long moment, then pushed a pawn forward 2 spaces. A safe opening, nothing fancy. Remy responded with her own pawn, and they settled into the quiet rhythm of the game. Outside, the sun was getting low, painting the cabin walls with golden light. Remy had lived alone for so long that she'd forgotten how different the space felt with another person in it. Smaller somehow, but also more alive. The boy was quiet, thinking 3 or 4 moves ahead, more than she'd expected. "Where'd you learn?" she asked after he'd captured one of her knights with a clever bishop move. "Library." Eli's voice was softer now, less guarded. "Used to go there after school, quiet and warm in winter." Remy nodded. She could picture it. A skinny kid with 2 big clothes hiding out in the stacks, learning to play chess from library books because it was better than going home to whatever was waiting there. They played 3 games. Eli won the second one, which surprised them both. By the time full darkness had settled over the mountain, the cabin felt less like a prison and more like a refuge. "You'll sleep up there," Remy said, nodding toward the loft. "There's blankets and a decent mattress. Gets cold at night, but the heat from the fireplace rises." Eli looked up at the ladder, then back at her. "What happens tomorrow?" "Tomorrow we start figuring out what you're made of. And if you decide I'm not worth the trouble." Remy studied his face in the firelight. 15 years ago she'd come to this mountain, running from her own ghosts, convinced she was too broken to be around other people. The isolation had been medicine at first, then habit, then something close to prison. She told herself she preferred it this way, that people were too complicated, too painful to love. But looking at this boy, this angry, frightened, proud boy who played chess like he was fighting for his life, she felt something stir in her chest that she'd thought was dead. "I don't give up easy," she said finally. "Question is whether you do." Eli climbed the ladder to the loft without another word. She heard him moving around up there, getting settled, and then silence. But it wasn't the empty silence she was used to. It was the kind of quiet that comes when 2 people are sharing the same space, breathing the same air. existing in the same small bubble of warmth and light, while the vast darkness of the mountain pressed in around them. Remy banked the fire and settled into her chair with a book, but the words wouldn't stay in focus. Instead, she found herself listening to the small sounds from above. The boy shifting on the mattress, his breathing gradually slowing towards sleep. She'd told Martha Hendricks she'd teach the boy something. What she hadn't said was that she suspected he might teach her something too. The sound that woke Remy wasn't loud, just the soft scrape of the cabin door closing. But after 15 years of living alone on the mountain, she'd learned to trust her instincts, and her instincts were screaming that something was wrong. She rolled out of bed and moved to the window, her bare feet silent on the cold wooden floor. The moon was 3/4 full, bright enough to cast sharp shadows across the clearing around her cabin. There, a thin figure picking his way carefully down the rocky trail that led toward the valley, moving like someone trying very hard not to be seen. Eli Remy pulled on her boots and jacket, grabbed her grandmother's hunting knife from its place on the mantel, and slipped out into the night. The September air bit at her face, carrying the sharp scent of pine and the promise of snow. Winter was still months away, but this high up, it started making its presence known early. She followed at a distance, using the tracking skills her grandmother had taught her 40 years ago. The boy was trying to be quiet, but he had no real understanding of how sound carried in the thin mountain air. Every loose rock he dislodged, every branch he brushed against, every labored breath echoed like a shout in the stillness. He was heading toward the main road, probably planning to hitchhike back to town. Part of her wanted to let him go. It would be easier, certainly. She could tell Martha Hendricks that she'd tried, that some boys just couldn't be helped. She could go back to her solitary life, her books and her chess set, and her carefully maintained distance from anything that might hurt her again. But something about the determined set of his thin shoulders, the way he kept looking back over his shoulder as if he expected someone to stop him, reminded her too much of another child who'd once tried to run from a situation that felt impossible. The trail curved around a stand of aspen trees, and when Remy reached the bend, she stopped. Eli was sitting on a fallen log, his head in his hands, shoulders shaking. Not from cold. She waited, watching him cry with the helpless fury of someone who'd been holding it in too long. When the sobs finally subsided, she stepped into the moonlight. "Hell of a night for a walk," she said quietly. Eli's head snapped up, his face streaked with tears he quickly wiped away. I mean, running away." Remy settled onto the log beside him, the knife resting across her knees. "Yeah, you were. Question is why. You know why." His voice was rough, angry. "Because this whole thing is stupid. My mother dumping me here like I'm some kind of problem to be solved. And you pretending like you actually want me around when we both know you'd rather be alone." Remy was quiet for a long moment, listening to the wind move through the trees. An owl called from somewhere in the darkness, answered by another from across the valley. Night sounds, wild sounds. The kind of sounds she'd grown to love during her years of solitude. "You're right," she said finally. "I would rather be alone. It's simpler, safer." Eli turned to look at her, surprise flickering across his tear-stained face. "But you know what I learned, living up here all these years?" Remy continued. "Sometimes what we want and what we need are two different things." She held up the hunting knife, its blade catching the moonlight. The handle was worn smooth from decades of use, carved with intricate patterns that spoke of long winter evenings and careful hands. "This was my grandmother's," she said. "She gave it to me when I was about your age. Not because I asked for it, but because she saw something in me that I didn't see in myself." "What?" "Stubbornness. The kind that can either destroy you or save you, depending on how you use it." Remy stood up, testing the weight of the knife in her hand. "My grandmother was half Ute, raised by her mother's people until she was 12. Then the government decided she needed to be civilized, sent her to one of those boarding schools where they tried to beat the Indian out of her." Eli was listening now, his escape plans temporarily forgotten. She ran away 7 times, Remy continued. 7 times they dragged her back. The 8th time she made it home. But by then, her world had changed. The old ways were disappearing, and she was caught between 2 worlds, belonging fully to neither. A cloud passed over the moon, plunging them into deeper darkness. Somewhere in the distance a coyote howled, a lonely sound that seemed to echo in Remy's chest. She could have given up, Remy said, could have let the anger and hurt consume her. Instead, she chose to preserve what she could. She learned to hunt and track and live off the land, not because she had to, but because those skills were worth saving, and she made sure to pass them on. To you, to me. And now, Remy turned to face Eli, seeing her own reflection in his dark eyes. Now I'm passing them on to you. Why? The word came out raw, desperate. Why do you care what happens to me? The question hung between them like a challenge. Remy could have given him easy answers. Because your mother asked her to, because it was the right thing to do, because everyone deserved a second chance. All true, but not the whole truth. Because I know what it's like, she said finally, to feel like the world has given up on you, to think that maybe everyone would be better off if you just disappeared. She sat back down, close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from his body, distant enough that he wouldn't feel trapped. I had a daughter once, she said quietly. The words seemed to surprise her as much as they surprised Eli. She hadn't spoken about Sarah to another living soul in 15 years. She was 8 when she died. Car accident. I was driving. Eli's breath caught. I'm sorry. Remy nodded, accepting the sympathy but not dwelling in it. Afterward, I didn't know how to live in a world without her. So I ran. Came up here and told myself I was better off alone, that caring about people was too dangerous. She looked up at the stars, bright and cold and infinite. But living like that, it's not really living. It's just existing, going through the motions until you die. So why are you telling me this? Because you remind me of her. The admission came out softer than she'd intended. Not in looks, but in spirit. She had this way of tilting her chin up when she was angry or scared, like she was daring the world to knock her down. Same way you do. Eli's hand went unconsciously to his chin. I can't bring her back, Remy continued. But maybe I can keep you from making the same mistakes I did, running away from everything good just because you're scared of getting hurt again. They sat in silence for a while, listening to the night sounds of the mountain. Finally, Eli spoke. My dad didn't die in some accident, he said quietly. He left when I was 10, just walked out one day and never came back. Mom's been angry about it ever since. At him, at me, at the whole world. That's why she drinks. Eli's shoulders tensed. How did you... Takes one to know one, Remy said simply. Though I've been sober 15 years now. She's not a bad person, Eli said quickly. She gets overwhelmed, and when she's overwhelmed she makes bad choices, like trading you to a stranger for livestock, like that. Remy stood up, brushing pine needles off her jeans. The sky was starting to lighten in the east, dawn still an hour away, but making its presence known. Come on, we need to get back before the weather turns. What weather? Eli looked up at the clear sky. The storm that's coming in from the northwest. You can smell it in the air. Eli sniffed experimentally. I don't smell anything. That's the first thing we're going to work on. Learning to read the signs. Remy started back up the trail, her pace steady but not hurried. The mountain doesn't care if you're paying attention or not. It'll kill you either way. But if you learn to listen, really listen, it'll teach you everything you need to know about survival. They walked back to the cabin in comfortable silence. Eli no longer trying to move quietly, Remy pointing out tracks in the soft earth, deer, rabbit, the pad marks of a mountain lion that had passed through sometime in the last few days. By the time they reached the clearing, the first snowflakes were starting to fall. How did you know? Eli asked, staring up at the sky in amazement. Practice, Remy said. Lots of practice, and learning to trust what your senses are telling you, even when your brain says it's impossible. She unlocked the cabin door and stepped inside, grateful for the warmth that greeted them. The fire had died down to glowing coals, but it was the work of minutes to coax it back to life. "Get some sleep," she said, hanging her jacket on its peg by the door. "Tomorrow we start your real education." Eli climbed the ladder to the loft, moving slowly, as if he were carrying a weight he hadn't had when he'd first descended it hours earlier. At the top, he paused and looked back down at her. "Remy." "Yeah?" "Thanks. For coming after me." She nodded, throat tight with unexpected emotion. "That's what family does." The word hung in the air between them, fragile and precious and terrifying. Then Eli disappeared into the loft, and Remy was left alone with the fire and the sound of snow beginning to accumulate on the cabin roof. She sat in her chair and watched the flames dance, the hunting knife still in her lap. Outside, the storm was building, but inside, something else was building too, something that felt like hope. The compass was older than Eli by several decades, its brass case worn smooth by countless hands. Remy placed it carefully in the boy's palm, watching his face as he felt the weight of it, the way the needle swung to find magnetic north with unwavering certainty. "My grandfather carried this through 3 wars, she said, settling cross-legged on the ground beside him. They were sitting in the meadow behind her cabin, the morning sun warm on their backs, despite the snow that had fallen 2 days earlier. Korea, Vietnam, and a few conflicts the government pretends never happened." Eli turned the compass over, examining the scratched initials on the back. "RJC 1943. What does the J stand for?" "James. Robert James Cade, my mother's father." Remy pointed to the compass needle. "He used to tell me that no matter how lost you get, no matter how turned around, that needle always knows the way home." "But north isn't home," Eli said, frowning at the instrument. "No, but it's a starting point. If you know where north is, you can figure out where everything else is in relation to it." Remy stood up, brushing pine needles off her jeans. "Come on. Time for your first real lesson." They spent the morning learning the basics. How to hold the compass steady, how to take a bearing, how to triangulate position using landmarks. Eli was a quick study, his mind sharp despite years of educational neglect. By noon, he could navigate from the cabin to the creek and back again, using only the compass and his own careful observations. "Good," Remy said as they sat by the water, sharing a simple lunch of bread and cheese. "But the compass is just a tool. The real skill is learning to read the land itself." She pointed across the valley to where the peaks of the Continental Divide rose like ancient guardians. "See how the snow line is lower on the north-facing slopes?" Eli squinted, nodding slowly. "Yeah, why?" "Less direct sunlight. North faces get morning light but lose it earlier in the day. South faces catch sun from dawn to dusk." Remy broke off a piece of cheese, chewing thoughtfully. "If you're ever lost without a compass, you can use that. Find a slope with more snow, you're looking north. What if it's summer? Then you look at the trees. Moss grows thicker on the north side of trunks because it's damper, shadier. Or you watch the way branches grow, fuller on the south side where they get more light." Eli absorbed this information with the intensity of someone discovering that the world was far more complex and interesting than he'd previously imagined. For the first time since arriving at the mountain, his attention wasn't focused on escape or survival, but on genuine curiosity. That afternoon, Remy taught him to build a fire without matches. She showed him how to gather tinder, dry grass, birch bark, pine needles, and how to arrange it in a nest that would catch and hold the smallest spark. Then came the harder part, creating that spark. "Flint and steel," she said, demonstrating the technique with practiced ease. "Strike down, not across. You want the sparks to fall into the tinder, not scatter away from it." Eli's first dozen attempts produced nothing but frustration and scraped knuckles. But Remy was patient, correcting his grip, showing him again and again how to position his hands, how to angle the steel just right. "I can't do it," he said finally, throwing the tools down in disgust. "You can't do it yet," Remy corrected. "There's a difference." She picked up the flint and steel, handed them back to him. "My grandmother used to say that every skill worth having requires you to fail at it first. The failing teaches you things success never can. Like what? Like humility, like patience, like the difference between giving up and trying a different approach. Eli tried again, adjusting his grip based on her guidance. This time, when he struck the steel against the flint, a small shower of sparks cascaded into the tinder nest. When caught, glowed, and then, with careful breathing, burst into flame. The look of wonder on his face was worth every minute of frustration that had preceded it. "I did it," he said, staring at the small flame as if it were a miracle. "You did. Now feed it. Small stuff first, twigs, dry leaves. You have to build it up slowly." They worked together, nursing the tiny fire into a proper cooking flame. When it was burning steadily, Remy produced a small iron pot and filled it with water from the creek. "Tonight you cook," she said. "Simple stew. Vegetables from the garden, a little meat from yesterday's hunt." The hunt had been their first real success together. A cottontail rabbit, taken with a snare Remy had shown him how to set. Eli had been squeamish about the killing at first, but when she'd explained about taking only what you need, about using every part of the animal, about the difference between hunting for survival and hunting for sport, he'd begun to understand. "My mom would freak if she could see this," he said, stirring the pot with a wooden spoon Remy had carved years ago. "She thinks camping is staying at a motel without room service." Remy smiled. "Different people have different ideas about what civilization means. What's your idea?" The question caught her off guard. She'd spent so many years focused on the practical aspects of survival that she'd almost forgotten there was a philosophy underlying it. "I think civilization is about taking care of each other," she said finally. "About building something that lasts. About passing on knowledge and skills and values from one generation to the next." Eli considered this as he added salt to the stew. "Is that why you're teaching me all this stuff? To pass it on?" "Partly." Remy poked at the fire with a stick, sending sparks spiraling into the evening air. "But mostly because I think you need to know you can take care of yourself. That you don't have to depend on other people's goodwill or charity to survive, because people let you down. People are human. They make mistakes, they get scared, they do stupid things sometimes. But if you know you can survive on your own, really survive, not just get by, then you can choose to depend on others because you want to, not because you have to." The stew was ready as the sun touched the western peaks. They ate in comfortable silence, watching the sky turn from blue to gold to deep purple. When full darkness had settled over the valley, Remy brought out her grandfather's chess set. "Your move," she said, arranging the familiar pieces. Eli had improved dramatically over the past few days. His opening was more sophisticated now, his mid-game planning more thoughtful. He was learning to think several moves ahead, to consider not just what he wanted to do, but what his opponent might do in response. "Remy," he said as he moved his queen into position for what might be checkmate in 3 moves. "What happened to your grandfather? The one who owned the compass?" Remy studied the board, seeing the trap he'd laid for her king. "Clever boy. He died when I was 12. Heart attack. Were you close?" "Very. He was the one who taught me most of what I know about living off the land." She moved her king out of immediate danger, but Eli's advantage was clear. "He was also the one who taught me to play chess. Did he let you win?" "Never. Said it wouldn't teach me anything except how to lose gracefully when I finally played someone who wouldn't." Remy smiled at the memory. "I didn't beat him until I was 15. When I finally did, he was so proud he took me fishing for 3 days straight to celebrate." Eli captured her remaining rook, putting her into check. "Check." Remy moved her king again, delaying the inevitable. "Where'd you really learn to play?" "I told you. The library. But why chess? Why not video games or sports or—" "Because it was quiet." Eli's voice grew softer, more thoughtful. "And because in chess, everything depends on what you do. Not luck, not whether you're big enough or fast enough or popular enough. Just whether you can think and plan and see patterns that other people miss. Is that what you were looking for? Something that depended only on you?" Eli moved his queen forward. "Checkmate." Remy stared at the board for a long moment, then tipped over her king in surrender. "Good game. You let me win. I did not. You could have moved your bishop to block. I could have, yes. But then you would have taken it with your knight, and I'd be in the same position 2 moves later. Remy began resetting the pieces. Sometimes the best strategy is knowing when you're beaten and conceding with grace. They played 2 more games. Remy won the first, Eli the second. By the time they packed up the chess set, the fire had burned down to glowing coals, and the night air was sharp with the promise of frost. Tomorrow, Remy said as they climbed the steps to the cabin, we'll work on tracking and water purification. And maybe, if you're ready for it, I'll show you how to set snares for bigger game. Eli paused with his hand on the door. Why are you doing all this, really? Remy looked up at the stars, brilliant and cold in the thin mountain air. Because 15 years ago I forgot how to live. I got so caught up in surviving that I stopped remembering what I was surviving for. She met his eyes, seeing something in them that reminded her of her younger self. Hungry, determined, afraid but trying not to show it. Maybe teaching you is helping me remember. Inside the cabin, Eli climbed to his loft while Remy banked the fire for the night. As she settled into her chair with a book, she could hear him moving around up there, getting ready for sleep. It was a comfortable sound, domestic and peaceful. Through the window, she could see the lights of town twinkling in the valley far below. For 15 years, those lights had seemed like a foreign country, too bright, too complicated, too full of people who might ask questions she wasn't ready to answer. But now, with the boy's presence changing the rhythm of her days, they didn't seem quite so distant. The compass sat on the table beside her chair, its needle pointing steadily north. Home, her grandfather had called it. But maybe, Remy thought as she listened to Eli's breathing slow towards sleep, home wasn't a direction at all. Maybe it was just a place where 2 people could sit by a fire and share stories and teach each other that survival wasn't the same thing as living. Maybe it was this. The deer trail was barely visible, just a slight depression in the forest floor where generations of white-tailed deer had worn a path through the undergrowth. Eli crouched beside it, his fingers tracing the edge of a hoofprint in the soft earth. Buck or doe? Remy asked quietly. Eli studied the track, remembering what she'd taught him about reading sign. Buck, see how deep the print is? Heavier animal. And the stride is longer. Good, how old? This was trickier. Eli examined the edges of the print, looking for the telltale signs of weathering that would indicate when it had been made. Yesterday morning, maybe? The edges are still sharp, but there's a little bit of leaf debris in the bottom. Very good. Remy moved carefully around the track, pointing to other signs. A bent twig at deer height, a few coarse hairs caught on a low branch, a scrape mark on a nearby tree where the buck had rubbed his antlers. What else do you see? It took Eli several minutes to spot it, a small pile of dark pellets partially hidden under a fallen log. Scat. Fresh. How do you know it's fresh? Still shiny. And it doesn't smell old. Remy nodded approvingly. 3 weeks on the mountain had sharpened Eli's senses in ways she'd hoped for but hadn't dared to expect. The boy who'd arrived hollow-eyed and defiant was still there. But underneath the anger, she was beginning to see someone else. Someone curious and capable and surprisingly gentle. They followed the trail deeper into the forest, Eli moving with increasing confidence over the uneven ground. He'd learned to step carefully, to avoid the dry branches that would snap and give away their position, to read the subtle changes in wind direction that might carry their scent to whatever they were tracking. There, Remy whispered, pointing through a gap in the trees. The buck stood in a small clearing, his head raised and alert. He was magnificent, probably 8 points, with a thick neck and the confident bearing of an animal that had survived several hunting seasons. Sunlight filtered through the canopy above, dappling his coat with patterns of light and shadow. Eli's breath caught. In all his 16 years, most of them spent in the concrete and asphalt world of small-town poverty, he'd never seen anything so purely wild, so completely at home in its environment. The buck's ears twitched, and he turned to look directly at them. For a moment, boy and deer regarded each other across the small distance that separated them. Then, with a flash of white tail, the animal bounded away into the deeper forest. Why didn't we try to get closer? Eli asked as they made their way back toward the cabin. Because we weren't hunting, Remy replied. We were learning to track. Different purpose, different rules. When will I be ready to hunt something that big? When you can track it for a full day without losing the trail. When you can predict where it's going to be before you get there. When you can make a clean kill shot at 50 yards with iron sights. Remy pushed through a stand of young aspen, their leaves golden in the afternoon light. And when you understand that taking a life, even for food, is something you don't do lightly. They walked in comfortable silence for a while, following a game trail that wound its way back toward Remy's cabin. The October air was crisp, carrying the scent of wood smoke from her chimney and the earthy smell of leaves beginning their final transformation. "Tell me about your grandmother," Eli said suddenly. Remy glanced at him, surprised by the request. Over the past 3 weeks, their conversations had focused mostly on practical skills. How to purify water, how to preserve meat, how to read weather patterns. Personal stories had been rare, shared reluctantly, and only when they served to illustrate some larger lesson. "What do you want to know?" "Everything. The stories you've told me, about the boarding school, about learning to hunt, they're all pieces. I want to know who she was." They emerged from the forest into the meadow behind Remy's cabin. The small garden plot where she grew vegetables was ready for winter now. The last of the root crops harvested and stored. The beds covered with mulch to protect the soil through the cold months ahead. Her name was Rose Standing Bear, Remy said, settling onto the wooden bench she'd built beside the garden, though the government renamed her Mary when they took her to the boarding school. She never answered to Mary, even after she learned English. Their names had power, and she wasn't going to let them steal hers. Eli sat beside her, close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from his body. He'd put on weight in the weeks since his arrival, not much, but enough that his clothes no longer hung on him like empty sacks. His face had filled out too, losing some of the sharp angles that had made him look hungry and desperate. "She met my grandfather when she was 18, Remy continued. He was a surveyor for the Forest Service, mapping the boundary lines for what would eventually become the National Forest. She was working as a guide for the survey crew, one of the few people in the area who knew the high country well enough to keep them from getting lost." "Love at first sight?" Remy smiled. "Hardly. She thought he was a fool city boy who'd get himself killed if left alone in the mountains for more than a day. He thought she was the most beautiful and terrifying woman he'd ever met. What changed their minds? A late spring blizzard that stranded the survey crew for 3 days in a shelter Rose built out of pine boughs and snow. She kept them all alive with nothing but a hunting knife and the skills she'd learned as a child. By the time the weather cleared, Grandpa was completely smitten. Remy stood and walked to the cabin, returning with a leather-bound journal that showed its age in every crease and stain. This was hers. Recipes mostly, but also remedies and observations about plants and weather patterns. She wrote it all down because she was afraid the knowledge would die with her. She opened the journal carefully, its pages yellow with age and use. The handwriting was precise, economical, each word chosen with care. Some entries were in English, others in what Eli assumed was Ute, the symbols flowing across the page like artwork. "What does this one say?" Eli asked, pointing to a passage written in the native language. Remy traced the words with her finger, translating slowly. "The earth remembers everything we give it, and everything we take from it. Those who take without giving will find that the earth remembers this too." "Did she teach you to speak Ute?" "Some. Not as much as I wish she had." Remy turned the page, revealing a detailed drawing of a plant Eli didn't recognize. She was more concerned with teaching practical skills. How to identify edible plants, how to make medicine from tree bark, how to preserve food without refrigeration. She flipped through several pages, stopping at a recipe written in careful English. "Wild rose hip syrup. Good for winter sickness and sore throats. She used to make this every fall," Remy said. "The whole cabin would smell like roses and honey. I haven't made it since—" She stopped, the sentence hanging unfinished. "Since your daughter died," Remy nodded, her throat tight with old grief. Sarah loved rosehip syrup. Used to drink it by the spoonful when she thought I wasn't looking. They sat quietly for a while, the journal open between them. A red-tailed hawk circled overhead, its cry echoing off the surrounding peaks. In the distance, a squirrel chattered angrily at some perceived threat. What happened to her? Eli asked softly. Your grandmother, I mean. She died when I was 22. Pneumonia. She was 83 and stubborn as a mule, insisted she could cure herself with traditional remedies. By the time I convinced her to see a doctor, it was too late. I'm sorry. She lived a full life. Saw her children and grandchildren grow up, passed on what she could of the old ways. Remy closed the journal gently. She used to say that death wasn't the enemy, forgetting was. As long as someone remembered the stories, remembered the skills, remembered the values that mattered, then nothing was really lost. Is that why you're teaching me? So the knowledge doesn't die with you? Remy looked at him, really looked, seeing not the angry, frightened boy who'd arrived a month ago, but the young man he was becoming. There was strength in him now, confidence that hadn't been there before. But more than that, there was a kind of quiet dignity, a sense of purpose that she recognized from her own youth. Partly, she said, but mostly because I think you need to know where you come from. Not just your blood family, but the larger family of people who've learned to live with the land instead of fighting against it. I'm not Native American. Doesn't matter. The skills don't belong to any one people. They belong to anyone willing to learn them and respect them and pass them on. Remy stood, brushing dried leaves off her jeans. Come on, time I taught you how to make rosehip syrup. They spent the rest of the afternoon gathering rosehips from the wild roses that grew along the creek bank. The work was pleasant, meditative, the repetitive motion of picking the small red fruits, the warmth of the October sun on their backs, the quiet companionship of shared purpose. My mom used to make cookies sometimes, Eli said as they worked, when she was sober. Chocolate chip from a package mix, but she'd let me help stir the dough and lick the spoon. Good memories. Yeah, few and far between, but good. Eli dropped another handful of rosehips into his gathering basket. She wasn't always, she used to be different. Before my dad left. What was she like before? Eli was quiet for so long that Remy thought he wasn't going to answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was soft with remembered affection. Happy, I guess. She used to sing while she cooked dinner. Terrible voice, but she didn't care. And she'd dance with me in the kitchen sometimes, spinning me around until we both got dizzy and fell down laughing. What changed? Everything. Dad leaving was just the start of it. Then she couldn't keep up with the bills on her own, had to take a second job, then a third. She was always tired, always stressed. And when she got stressed, she drank. Yeah, at first just a beer or two after work to relax. Then it was a beer with lunch. Then it was whatever was cheapest at the liquor store. Eli's hand stilled on the rosebush. I used to think it was my fault. That if I'd been a better kid, if I'd caused less trouble, maybe she wouldn't have needed to drink. And now I think maybe we were both just trying to survive the best way we knew how. They finished gathering rosehips as the sun touched the western peaks. Back at the cabin, Remy showed Eli how to clean the fruits, removing the seeds and stems, how to simmer them slowly with honey and water until the liquid turned deep red and fragrant. The key is patience, she said, stirring the pot with a wooden spoon. Rush it and you'll end up with something bitter. Take your time, let the flavors develop naturally, and you'll have something that can last all winter. As the syrup simmered, filling the cabin with its sweet floral scent, Eli climbed to his loft and returned with a small piece of wood he'd been carving in his spare time. It was rough still, obviously the work of an amateur, but Remy could see what it was meant to be, a chess piece, a knight in the distinctive style of her grandmother's set. I've been working on it, he said, almost shyly. Thought maybe, if you don't mind, I could make a whole set. My own set. Remy took the carving carefully, feeling the weight of it, seeing the careful attention to detail, despite the inexperienced hand that had shaped it. The knight's mane was roughly textured, its expression alert and intelligent. It wasn't perfect, but it was clearly made with love. It's beautiful, she said, and meant it. Your grandmother would have approved. She always said the best gifts were the ones made with your own hands. That evening, they sat by the fire with steaming mugs of rose-hip syrup, playing chess on the board her grandmother had carved decades ago. Eli won 2 games out of 3, his strategy more sophisticated now, his understanding of the game deeper and more intuitive. "Tomorrow," Remy said, as they packed up the pieces, "I'll show you how to set snares for rabbits, and how to skin and dress whatever you catch. Will it bother you? The killing, I mean." Remy considered the question carefully. "It will bother me if it stops bothering you. Taking a life should never be easy, even when it's necessary. The moment it becomes routine, something important gets lost." "What?" "Respect, gratitude, the understanding that we're all connected, predator and prey, hunter and hunted. We take what we need to survive, but we don't take more than that. And we don't take it lightly." Eli nodded, absorbing this wisdom the way he'd absorbed everything else she'd taught him, with serious attention and growing understanding. As he climbed to his loft for the night, Remy remained by the fire, the journal open in her lap. She turned to a page she hadn't read in years, one of her grandmother's longer entries written in careful English. "The children who come to us broken are not accidents. They are gifts sent to teach us that healing is possible, that love is stronger than fear, that the skills and wisdom we carry are meant to be shared. We save them, but in saving them, we save ourselves." Outside, the wind moved through the pines with a sound like distant voices. Rose Standing Bear's voice, perhaps, carried on the mountain air to remind her granddaughter that some lessons were worth learning more than once. The fishing rod felt perfect in Eli's hands. Balanced, responsive, an extension of his own arm rather than a foreign tool. They'd spent 3 days crafting it together, selecting the right piece of flexible willow, seasoning it over the fire, wrapping the handle with leather strips cut from an old jacket. The guides were carved from bone. The reel, a simple wooden spool that Remy had helped him turn on her grandmother's ancient lathe. Cast upstream. "Let the current bring the fly down naturally," Remy instructed from her position on the bank. "The trout can feel the line cutting through the water if you're too aggressive with it," Eli nodded, concentrating on the rhythm she'd taught him. Back paws forward, letting the line unfurl in a smooth arc that dropped his hand-tied fly just above a promising pool. He'd been practicing for weeks now, and what had once seemed impossible, controlling the line, reading the water, timing the cast, was beginning to feel natural. The strike came without warning. One moment the fly was drifting innocently downstream. The next, his rod was bent nearly double, and a flash of silver was fighting desperately in the clear mountain water. "Easy," Remy called. "Let him run if he wants to. Your line's strong enough." But Eli was already doing what she'd taught him, playing the fish with patience and skill, giving line when the trout ran, reeling in steadily when it tired. 5 minutes later, he guided a beautiful rainbow trout into the shallows, where Remy waited with the net. 15 inches, maybe 16, she said, admiring the fish's brilliant colors. "Good size for these waters." Eli knelt beside the trout, his hands gentle as he held it. 3 months ago he would have been squeamish about touching a live fish. Now he handled it with the confidence of someone who understood that taking life for sustenance was part of the natural order. Serious work that required respect but not hesitation. "Thank you," he said quietly to the fish, then dispatched it quickly with the small club Remy had carved for him. It was a ritual she'd taught him, acknowledging the gift of the animal's life, honoring the connection between hunter and prey. They cleaned the fish by the creek, Eli's knife work clean and efficient. He'd become skilled with a blade over the past months, learning to fillet fish, joint rabbits, and butcher the deer he'd finally taken 2 weeks earlier, a clean shot through the heart at 40 yards that had provided them with meat for the coming winter. "Your hands are steadier now," Remy observed, watching him work. More confident, it was true. The boy who'd arrived at her cabin in September had been all sharp angles and nervous energy, his movements quick and uncertain. The young man working beside her now moved with deliberate precision, each action considered and purposeful. "I've been thinking." Eli said as they walked back toward the cabin. About what happens after winter, Remy felt something tighten in her chest. She'd been dreading this conversation, knowing it was inevitable but hoping to postpone it as long as possible. What about it? Will I stay here? Or will my mum want me back when the weather warms up? The question hung between them like morning mist, insubstantial but impossible to ignore. Remy had been asking herself the same thing for weeks, ever since it became clear that Eli wasn't the burden she'd expected, but something far more dangerous. Family. I don't know, she said honestly. Legally, she's still your mother. She can take you back whenever she wants, even if I don't want to go. Even then, until you turn 18. They climbed the steps to the cabin in silence, both lost in their own thoughts. Inside, Remy busied herself preparing the trout for their evening meal, while Eli tended the fire. It was a comfortable routine they'd developed, each taking responsibility for different aspects of their daily life, working together with the easy cooperation of people who'd learned to trust each other completely. There's something I should tell you, Eli said as they sat down to eat. About my mom. Remy looked up from her plate, noting the serious tone in his voice. What about her? She's been drinking more. A lot more. Eli poked at his fish with his fork, not meeting her eyes. Mrs. Henderson, she lives next door to us. She's been sending me letters. Mom doesn't know. What do the letters say? That Mom lost her job at the diner 3 weeks ago. That she's been staying out all night, coming home drunk or not coming home at all. That the landlord's been by asking about the rent. Remy set down her fork, her appetite suddenly gone. How long has this been going on? Since right after she brought me here. Maybe before. Eli's voice was steady, but she could see the pain in his eyes. Mrs. Henderson thinks she's having some kind of breakdown. Says she keeps talking about how she failed as a mother, how she ruined everything. And what do you think? I think she traded me away because she was scared. And now she's trying to drink away the guilt. They finished their meal in contemplative silence. Outside, the November wind was picking up, rattling the windows and sending pine needles skittering across the cabin roof. Winter was coming early this year. Remy could feel it in the dropping barometric pressure, smell it in the sharp bite of the air. After dinner, Eli retreated to his loft to work on his chess set. He'd completed 6 pieces now, each one more skillfully carved than the last. The knight he'd started with had been joined by a king, 2 pawns, a bishop, and a rook. They weren't as refined as the pieces in Remy's grandmother's set, but they had character, each one slightly different. Bearing the marks of their maker's growing skill and confidence, Remy sat by the fire with her grandmother's journal, reading passages she'd memorized years ago, but still found comforting. There was wisdom in those pages, hard-earned insights about life and loss, and the courage required to keep going when everything seemed hopeless. A knock at the door interrupted her reading. Visitors were rare this high up the mountain, especially with winter approaching. Remy rose cautiously, her hand automatically moving to the hunting knife she kept on the mantel. Through the window, she could see a figure on horseback, bundled against the cold. She opened the door to find Jake Morrison, her nearest neighbor, sitting astride his old gelding. Jake ran cattle on the lower slopes of the mountain, a third-generation rancher who'd inherited more land than he could properly work, and more debts than he could easily pay. Evening. Remy, he said, touching the brim of his hat. Sorry to bother you so late. No bother. What brings you up here? Jake's weathered face was grim. Wanted to give you a heads up. There's been talk in town about the boy. Remy felt her stomach drop. What kind of talk? The kind that happens when people have too much time on their hands and not enough facts to work with. Jake's horse shifted restlessly, sensing its rider's tension. Some folks are saying you're keeping the boy up here against his will. Others think you're not properly caring for him. Child services kind of talk. Who's saying this? Started with the Hendersons, I think. They've been worried about Martha. She's been making quite a spectacle of herself down at Murphy's bar. Crying about how she abandoned her son, how she's the worst mother in the world. Jake's expression softened slightly. I don't think she means any harm, but drunk talk has a way of growing legs. From the loft above, Remy heard the soft sound of Eli moving around. He was listening, she realized. Probably hearing every word. What exactly are people saying? That you're some kind of survivalist nut who's brainwashing the boy. That he's being held up here like a prisoner. That someone should check on his welfare. Jake leaned forward in his saddle. I tried to set folks straight. Told them what I've seen when I ride up this way. The boy looks healthy, happy even. But you know how it is. Once people get an idea in their heads, it's hard to shake loose. Remy finished the thought, her mind already racing through the implications. Any idea who might come calling? County sheriff, maybe. Social services, if they get involved. Could be nobody. Sometimes talk just stays talk. Jake gathered his reins, preparing to leave. Just thought you should know. That boy's lucky to have found you, whatever the circumstances. Don't let the gossips tell you different. After Jake rode away, Remy stood in the doorway for a long time, listening to the wind in the pines and thinking about unintended consequences. She'd been so focused on teaching Eli to survive in the wilderness that she'd forgotten about the different kind of survival required to navigate the social wilderness of small-town politics and prejudice. I heard, Eli said quietly from the top of the ladder. She looked up to find him sitting on the edge of the loft, his legs dangling over the side. In the firelight, he looked older than his 16 years, his expression serious and thoughtful. What do you want to do? She asked. I want to stay here. With you. The words came out firm, decisive. This is the first place I've ever felt like I belonged, even if it means trouble. Official trouble? Especially then. Eli climbed down the ladder, moving with the fluid grace he'd developed over months of mountain living. You've taught me to track, to hunt, to survive. But more than that, you've taught me that I'm worth something. That I have value beyond being a burden or a disappointment. He picked up the fishing rod they'd made together, running his fingers along its smooth surface. My mom gave up on me because she couldn't see past her own pain. The people in town, they don't even know me, but they're ready to believe the worst about both of us. And I'd rather fight for something worth having than give up and go back to being nobody special in a world that doesn't care whether I live or die. Remy felt a fierce pride swell in her chest, mixed with an equally fierce protectiveness. This boy, her boy, she realized with some surprise, had found his strength, his voice, his sense of his own worth. Whatever came next, they'd face it together. All right then, she said. But if we're going to fight, we need to be smart about it. Legal smart? What do you mean? I mean I have some phone calls to make. Some old favors to call in. Remy moved to a wooden box she kept on a high shelf, pulling out an address book that looked like it hadn't been opened in years. Turns out being a hermit for 15 years doesn't erase the fact that you used to have a different life. A life with connections. Eli watched as she flipped through the pages, stopping at a name that seemed to satisfy her. Who are you calling? Someone who owes me a favor. Someone who understands that family isn't always about blood, and that sometimes the system gets it wrong. Remy closed the address book with a snap. But first, we need to prepare. If social services comes calling, I want them to see exactly what you've become up here. How you've grown. How you've thrived. They spent the rest of the evening documenting everything, the skills Eli had learned, the weight he'd gained, the confidence he'd developed. Remy took photographs with an old Polaroid camera, showing Eli cleaning fish, tending the fire, working on his chess set. Evidence of a boy who wasn't being neglected or abused, but nurtured and taught and loved. As they worked, the wind continued to build outside, bringing with it the scent of snow and the promise of a winter that would test everything they'd built together. But inside the cabin, warmed by fire and purpose and the deep satisfaction of meaningful work, they prepared to fight for the family they'd chosen and the life they'd created together. The battle was coming, but they would be ready. The photograph was tucked between the pages of a book about medicinal plants, yellowed with age and torn along one edge. Eli found it while reorganizing Remy's bookshelf, a task she'd assigned him during the December snowstorm that had kept them cabin-bound for 3 days. At first glance, it looked like any family snapshot from the 1990s. A woman in her 30s with long dark hair, laughing at something outside the camera's range. But as Eli studied it more closely, He realized with a start that the woman was Remy, though younger and softer somehow, her face unlined by the years of solitude that had followed. What stopped his breath entirely was the small figure in the corner of the photograph. A little girl with bright eyes and pigtails, caught in the middle of what looked like a gleeful leap off a fallen log. "Find something interesting?" Eli spun around, his heart hammering. Remy stood in the doorway, her arms full of firewood, snowflakes melting in her hair. Her eyes went immediately to the photograph in his hands, and he watched her face close off, the easy companionship of the morning replaced by something guarded and painful. "I'm sorry," he said quickly. "I wasn't snooping. It just fell out when I moved the book, and it's all right." But her voice was careful, controlled. She set down the firewood and held out her hand. "May I?" Eli gave her the photograph, noting how her fingers trembled slightly as she took it. She stared at it for a long moment, her thumb tracing the edge where it had been torn. "That's her, isn't it?" he asked quietly. "Your daughter?" Remy nodded, still looking at the picture. "Sarah, she was 8 when this was taken. We were camping up at Mirror Lake. She'd just learned to skip stones and was so proud of herself she wanted to demonstrate every 5 minutes. She moved to her chair by the fire, settling into it like someone suddenly feeling her age. Eli followed, unsure whether he should press for more information or let the subject drop. But something in Remy's expression, a kind of resigned exhaustion, as if she'd been carrying a weight too long and was finally ready to set it down, encouraged him to sit down across from her. "What was she like?" he asked. A ghost of a smile crossed Remy's face. "Fearless, curious about everything. She collected rocks and feathers and interesting leaves. Our house was full of her treasures." The smile faded. "She would have loved it up here. The mountains, the wildlife, the space to explore. Why didn't you bring her here? After your grandmother died, I mean. Because I had a different life then. A job, a mortgage, responsibilities." Remy set the photograph on the small table beside her chair, facing it away from them both. "I was a family court mediator in Denver. Spent my days helping broken families figure out custody arrangements, trying to protect children from parents who couldn't or wouldn't take care of them properly." Eli felt a chill that had nothing to do with the storm outside. "Like me and my mom, sometimes. Though your situation was different. Your mother loves you. She's just lost and scared and making bad choices because of it." Remy stared into the fire, her voice growing distant with memory. "Sarah's father and I divorced when she was 6. Nothing dramatic. We just grew apart, wanted different things. He moved to California for work, visited when he could. Sarah lived with me. What happened to her?" The question hung in the air between them, heavy with dread. Remy was quiet for so long that Eli began to think she wouldn't answer. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "I killed her." The words hit Eli like a physical blow. "What?" "December 15th, 2008. We were driving home from her school Christmas program. She'd played an angel in the nativity play and was still wearing her costume." Remy's hands were clenched in her lap, knuckles white with tension. "It was snowing. Roads were slick. I should have been more careful." "Remy," she was singing in the back seat. Some song they'd taught her at school, something about silver bells. She had a terrible voice, completely tone-deaf, but she didn't care. The words were coming faster now, as if a dam had burst. "I was listening to her sing and thinking about how proud I was, how perfect she was, when the truck ran the red light." Eli reached across the space between their chairs, covering one of her clenched hands with his own. Her skin was cold, trembling. "It wasn't your fault," he said firmly. "I was the adult. I was responsible for keeping her safe." Remy's voice cracked. "The other driver was drunk, completely wasted at 7 o'clock on a Tuesday evening. He walked away from the accident without a scratch. Sarah died on the way to the hospital." They sat in silence, the fire crackling and popping, while snow continued to pile up outside the windows. Eli thought about all the times over the past few months when Remy had seemed to see something in him that no one else had seen. The way she'd pushed him to be better, stronger, more than he'd ever imagined he could be. "Is that why you came here?" he asked eventually. Because you blamed yourself. I couldn't function, couldn't work, couldn't sleep, couldn't stand to be around other people's children and remember what I'd lost. Remy pulled her hands free and picked up the photograph again, staring at her daughter's laughing face. I thought if I came here, to the place where my grandmother had found peace, maybe I could learn to live with what I'd done. And did you learn to live with it? I learned to survive with it. There's a difference. She set the photograph back on the table, this time facing it toward them. I told myself I was better off alone, that caring about people was too dangerous, too painful, and for 15 years I almost believed it. What changed? Remy looked at him then, really looked at him, seeing not the angry, frightened boy who'd arrived 4 months ago, but the confident young man he'd become under her care. You did, she said simply. From the moment you walked into this cabin, you reminded me of what I'd lost. Not Sarah specifically, but the capacity to love someone more than your own safety. The willingness to risk getting hurt again for the chance to matter to another person. Eli felt tears prick at his eyes. You matter to me too, more than anyone ever has, I know, and that terrifies me. Remy managed a watery smile. Because loving you means I have something to lose again. It means I care what happens to you, what kind of man you become, whether you're happy or safe or fulfilled. Good, Eli said fiercely. I want you to care. I want to matter to you the way you matter to me. They talked long into the night, sharing stories about loss and guilt, and the slow, painful process of learning to hope again. Remy told him about Sarah's laugh, her questions that never stopped coming, her habit of naming every animal they encountered on their hiking trips. Eli told her about the loneliness of growing up with a mother who loved him but couldn't show it, about the nights he'd lain awake, wondering if anyone would miss him if he disappeared. The people in town, Eli said as the fire burned low, the ones Jake warned us about, they think you're holding me here against my will. Are you here against your will? I'm here because it's the first place I've ever felt like I belonged, like I was wanted for who I am, not in spite of it. Remy nodded slowly. Then we'll face whatever comes together. As family. Even though I'm not really your son, family isn't just about blood, Eli. It's about choice. It's about choosing to love someone and be responsible for them and help them become the best version of themselves. She picked up the photograph one more time, studying it with eyes that were sad, but no longer haunted. Sarah was my daughter by birth, but you're my son by choice, and that's just as real, just as permanent. The next morning dawned clear and cold, the storm having blown itself out during the night. They worked together to dig out from the snow, clearing paths to the woodshed and the root cellar, checking on their supplies and making sure their preparations for winter were complete. As they worked, Eli noticed that Remy seemed lighter somehow, as if sharing her secret had lifted a weight she'd been carrying for too long. She smiled more easily, laughed at his jokes, seemed more present in the moment rather than lost in memories of what she'd lost. That evening, as they played chess by the fire, she did something she hadn't done since he'd arrived. She talked about the future. When spring comes, she said, studying the board between them, I think we should expand the garden. Maybe add some fruit trees if we can find varieties that'll grow at this altitude. What about social services? What about my mom? We'll deal with whatever comes, but I'm not giving up on us, on what we've built here, without a fight. She moved her queen into position, threatening his king. Check. Eli studied the board, looking for an escape route. But instead of the panic he used to feel when trapped, he felt only calm determination. There was always a way out if you looked hard enough, planned carefully enough, refused to give up. Check, he said, moving his own queen to threaten her king while simultaneously blocking her attack. Remy smiled, her eyes bright with pride and affection. Well played. Outside, the wind sang through the pines, carrying the scent of snow and the promise of challenges yet to come. But inside the cabin, warmed by fire and love and the deep satisfaction of family chosen rather than simply inherited, they prepared for whatever battle lay ahead. They had each other now. And that, Remy thought as she watched Eli plan his next move with careful precision, made all the difference. The sound of an engine struggling up the mountain road reached them long before the vehicle came into view. Remy and Eli were splitting firewood behind the cabin, working with the easy rhythm they'd developed over months of partnership, when the distant growl made them both pause. "Expecting anyone?" Eli asked, though they both knew the answer. Remy shook her head, setting down her axe and moving to where she could see the road. It was January, deep winter, and the track up to her cabin was barely passable even with chains. Only someone with urgent business or legal authority would attempt the drive in these conditions. The pickup truck that finally wheezed into view was rust-eaten and smoking, its engine clearly on its last legs. But it was the woman who climbed out of the driver's seat that made Eli's face go pale. Martha Hendricks looked like she'd aged a decade in the 5 months since she'd dropped her son off at Remy's door. Her face was thinner, her clothes hanging, loose on a frame that had lost too much weight too quickly. But it was her eyes that told the real story, red-rimmed, desperate, with the glassy sheen of someone who'd been drinking too much for too long. "Eli!" she called, her voice carrying an edge of hysteria. "Eli, honey, come here. Mama's here to take you home." Eli stepped behind Remy, his body tense as a bowstring. What's she doing here? Before Remy could answer, a second figure emerged from the passenger side of the truck, a man in his 40s with slicked back hair and a smile that didn't reach his eyes. He was better dressed than Martha, his jacket newer and his boots expensive. Everything about him screamed money, but the kind of money that came with strings attached. "You must be Remy Cade," the man said, extending a hand that she didn't take. "I'm Derek Walsh, Martha's friend." "Boyfriend," Martha corrected, swaying slightly on her feet. "Derek's been helping me get my life together. Haven't you, honey?" Derek's smile tightened almost imperceptibly. "That's right. And part of getting Martha's life together means reuniting her with her son." "Eli's doing fine where he is," Remy said calmly, though inside she was calculating distances, escape routes, the location of the shotgun she kept by the cabin door. "I'm sure he is," Derek replied smoothly, "but the thing is, Martha here has had a change of heart. She misses her boy, wants him back home where he belongs." Martha nodded eagerly, though the motion seemed to make her dizzy. "I've been clean for 3 weeks now, Eli. 3 whole weeks. Derek's been helping me, taking care of me. We got a nice little place in town and—" "Mom." Eli stepped out from behind Remy, his voice steady but his hands shaking. "You're drunk right now." "I am not." Martha's voice rose to a near shriek. "I maybe had a couple beers for the drive, but that doesn't—" "Martha!" Derek interrupted, his tone sharp. "Let me handle this." He reached into his jacket and pulled out a manila folder, thick with official-looking documents. "The fact is, Ms. Cade, regardless of whatever informal arrangement you had with Martha, she never legally surrendered custody of her son. These papers prove that." Remy took the folder, scanning the documents with growing unease. Birth certificates, school records, and most damning, a custody decree from Eli's parents' divorce that clearly established Martha as the primary custodial parent. "Furthermore," Derek continued, "we have reason to believe that Eli is being held here against his will, isolated from his friends, denied proper education, subjected to—" "That's bullshit," Eli said fiercely. "Nobody's holding me here. I want to be here." "You're 16 years old," Derek replied. "What you want is irrelevant. What matters is what's legal. And legally, your mother has every right to take you home." "Why now?" Remy asked quietly. "Why, after all these months, does she suddenly want him back?" Something flickered in Derek's eyes, something calculating and cold. "A mother's love doesn't follow a schedule. Ms. Cade, Martha's been working hard to get her life together, and now she feels ready to be the parent Eli deserves. It's not about the money," Martha said suddenly, then clapped a hand over her mouth as if the words had escaped against her will. "What money?" Remy asked. Derek shot Martha a warning look. "Nothing that concerns you. This is about family reunification, plain and simple. But Eli was staring at his mother with growing understanding. Dad's land, the property Grandpa Joe left him before he died. That's what this is about, isn't it? Martha's face crumpled. Eli, honey, it's not like that. I mean, yes, there's some property that technically belongs to you, but I can't inherit it unless I'm living with my legal guardian, Eli finished. And you can't touch it unless you have custody of me. It's complicated, Derek said smoothly. Legal matters often are. But the important thing is that your mother wants you back. She's clean now, she's stable, and she has the legal right— She's not clean, Eli interrupted. I can smell the vodka on her breath from here. Martha started to protest, but Derek silenced her with a gesture. Addiction is a disease, son. Your mother's fighting it every day. But that doesn't change the fact that she's your legal guardian, and she wants you home. I'm not going. The words hung in the cold air like a challenge. Derek's mask of false pleasantness slipped for just a moment, revealing something much harder underneath. I'm afraid that's not your choice, he said. We can do this the easy way or the hard way. But you are coming with us today, over my dead body, Remy said quietly. Derek turned to face her fully, and she saw that whatever else he might be, he wasn't just some opportunistic boyfriend looking for easy money. There was intelligence in his eyes, and calculation, and the kind of patience that spoke of someone accustomed to getting what he wanted. Ms. Cade, I understand you've grown attached to the boy. But interfering with a parent's legal custody rights is a serious crime. Kidnapping, in fact. I'd hate to see you face charges over a misguided attempt to— Call the sheriff, Remy said to Eli without taking her eyes off Derek. Tell him we have trespassers making threats. Now there's no need for that, Derek replied, but his tone had shifted. Become more cautious. We're all reasonable people here. Surely we can work something out. What kind of something? Derek smiled, and this time it was genuine. The smile of a predator who'd found an opening. Well, I imagine you've grown quite fond of the boy, and he's clearly thrived under your care. Perhaps there's a way for everyone to get what they want. Keep talking. The inheritance in question is substantial. 160 acres of prime ranch land, plus mineral rights that could be quite valuable if developed properly. Derek's voice took on the cadence of a practiced salesman. Now legally, that all belongs to Eli. But practically speaking, a minor can't manage such assets without adult supervision. You want to buy me off. I want to propose a partnership. You clearly care about the boy's welfare. We clearly need someone with experience in, let's call it alternative lifestyle choices, to help manage his inheritance. Derek spread his hands in a gesture of false reasonableness. Everyone wins. Eli gets his inheritance, Martha gets her son back, you get a substantial consulting fee for your expertise, and you get a cut of the mineral rights. Derek's smile widened. I'm a businessman, Ms. Cade. I don't work for free. Remy looked at Martha, seeing past the alcohol and desperation to the woman who'd brought her son up the mountain 5 months ago. There had been love there then, buried under layers of frustration and exhaustion. But what she saw now was something different, a person who'd sold her integrity so completely that she'd convinced herself she was doing the right thing. What about what Eli wants? Remy asked. He's a minor, Derek repeated. Minors don't get to choose. That's why we have parents. I choose you, Eli said quietly to Remy. I choose this life, this place, this family. I don't care about the money. That's very touching, Derek said, his patience finally wearing thin. But it's also irrelevant. Martha, get in the truck. We're taking the boy home now. No. Remy stepped between Derek and Eli, her hand moving casually toward the hunting knife she wore on her belt. You want the boy, you go through proper legal channels. Get a court order, involve social services, do whatever you need to do. But you don't take him from here today without his consent. Derek's face darkened. That's kidnapping, Ms. Cade. I warned you. And threatening someone on their own property with abduction is criminal menacing. I warned you. They stared at each other across the snowy clearing, the tension thick enough to cut. Finally, Derek stepped back, his hands raised in mock surrender. Very well. We'll do this the legal way. He helped Martha back into the truck, ignoring her protests. "But understand, Ms. Cade, we will be back. With papers, with authorities, with whatever it takes to reunite this family. And when we return, I suggest you don't interfere." The truck started with a grinding whine and pulled away, leaving deep ruts in the snow. Remy and Eli watched until it disappeared around the first bend, then stood in the sudden silence, both of them shaking with adrenaline and fear. "They'll be back," Eli said finally. "Yes," Remy agreed. "They will. What do we do?" Remy looked at the boy, her boy, in every way that mattered, seeing the fear in his eyes but also the determination. 5 months on the mountain had changed him from a lost, angry child into a young man capable of making hard choices and standing by them. "We fight," she said simply. "We fight for what we've built here, for what we mean to each other, for your right to choose the life you want to live, even if we lose. Especially if we might lose." Remy put her arm around his shoulders, feeling the solid strength of him, the warm reality of his presence beside her. "Some things are worth fighting for, Eli. Family is one of them. The family you choose, the family you build, the family that chooses you back." They walked back to the cabin together, already planning their next move, already preparing for a battle that would determine not just where Eli lived, but who he would become and what kind of family was worth preserving. The real fight was just beginning. The old lever-action rifle felt heavier than Remy remembered as she lifted it from its resting place above the cabin door. She hadn't touched the weapon in 15 years, not since the day she'd arrived on the mountain, carrying nothing but grief and a desperate need to disappear. But now, as she checked the action and counted the cartridges in the magazine, she felt the familiar weight of responsibility settling across her shoulders. "You really think we'll need that?" Eli asked, watching her clean the rifle with practiced efficiency. "I hope not. But Derek Walsh isn't just some opportunistic boyfriend looking for easy money. He's organized, patient, and he knows exactly what he wants." Remy worked a cloth through the barrel, her movements automatic. "Men like that don't give up when they encounter resistance. They escalate." It had been 3 days since Martha and Derek's visit, and Remy had spent every waking hour preparing for what was coming. The first call had been to her old friend Michael Chen, a family court judge in Denver, who owed her more favors than either of them cared to count. "Remy Cade," he'd said when she identified herself, his voice warm with genuine pleasure. "I was beginning to think you'd died up there in the mountains." "Not yet, though I may need your help to avoid it," she'd replied, then explained the situation with Eli, Martha, and Derek's obvious financial motivations. Michael had listened without interruption, asking only a few clarifying questions. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment. "It's complicated," he said finally. "Legally, the mother does have custody rights. But if we can prove she's unfit, the drinking, the boyfriend's influence, the obvious financial exploitation, we might have grounds for an emergency hearing." "What would that require?" "Documentation. Evidence of neglect or abuse. Testimony from reliable witnesses about the boy's well-being under your care." Michael paused. "And Remy, you need to understand what you're asking. If you go down this road, if you formally challenge for guardianship, your life becomes an open book. Everything you've been running from for the past 15 years, it all comes out in court." Remy had looked across the cabin at Eli, who was working on another chess piece, his face peaceful and concentrated. The boy who'd arrived broken and angry had become someone she couldn't imagine living without. Her student, her companion, her son in every way that mattered. "I understand," she told Michael. "Do whatever you need to do." The second call had been harder, to Dr. Patricia Reeves, the therapist who'd tried to help her work through her grief after Sarah's death. Patricia had been patient with Remy's silence, professional with her pain, and devastated when Remy had simply stopped showing up for appointments and disappeared into the mountains. "I wondered if I'd ever hear from you again," Patricia said after Remy explained why she was calling. How are you, Remy?" "Really? Better than I was. Different than I was." Remy had found herself telling Patricia about Eli, about the slow process of learning to care again, about the way teaching someone else to survive had taught her the difference between surviving and living. "But I need your help now. Professional help." Patricia agreed to drive up to the cabin, to meet Eli and assess his mental state, to provide expert testimony about his well-being and the quality of care he was receiving. More importantly, she agreed to testify about Remy's fitness as a guardian, her stability, her competence, her capacity to provide a safe and nurturing environment. The third call had been to Jake Morrison, asking him to spread the word among the other ranchers and longtime residents of the valley. Within hours, Remy had received visits from people she hadn't spoken to in years, neighbors who'd watched from a distance as she'd built her solitary life on the mountain, who'd respected her privacy but had always been ready to help if asked. "That boy's done nothing but good since he's been up here," Jake had said, his weathered face serious. "Anyone with eyes can see he's thriving. If you need folks to testify to that, you'll have them." Old Tom Bradley, whose family had ranched in the valley for 4 generations, had been even more direct. "That woman who brought the boy up here, Martha something, she's been making a spectacle of herself down at Murphy's bar for months, crying drunk about how she abandoned her son, then bragging about the money she's going to come into. Half the town's seen it." The most surprising visitor had been Dr. Angela Martinez from the county health department. She'd driven up the mountain on chains, bringing with her a thick file and a grim expression. "I shouldn't be here," she'd said without preamble. "This conversation never happened, and I never showed you these files." "Understood?" Remy had nodded, accepting the folder Dr. Martinez handed her. "Derek Walsh has been busy since he hooked up with your boy's mother. 3 calls to Child Protective Services claiming you're holding the boy against his will. 2 formal complaints about inadequate educational provisions. 1 anonymous tip about suspected child abuse. Anonymous? Made from a payphone. But the caller knew details that only someone familiar with the situation would know. Dr. Martinez had stood by the window, looking out at the snow-covered landscape. "Thing is, we take these complaints seriously. We have to. So I've been quietly investigating. And I've talked to Jake Morrison, to the Hendersons, to people who've seen the boy in town. 2 a 1, they all say the same thing. He's healthier, happier, more confident than he's ever been. Whatever you're doing up here, it's working." Dr. Martinez had turned back to face Remy, her expression troubled. "But Walsh is persistent. He's threatening to go to the state if we don't act on his complaints. And he's got lawyers, expensive ones. What happens next?" "Next, I'm required to make an official welfare check. I'll come back tomorrow with a social worker. We'll interview the boy, inspect the living conditions, file our report." She'd moved toward the door, then paused. "Remy, whatever else happens, don't let them take that boy back to his mother. I've seen her medical records. She's been in and out of detox 3 times in the past 6 months. She's not clean, she's not stable, and she sure as hell isn't putting her son's welfare first." Now, as Remy finished cleaning the rifle and returned it to its rack, she reflected on how much her life had changed in just a few days. For 15 years, she'd been a hermit, disconnected from the community she'd once been part of. But reaching out for help had reminded her that isolation wasn't the same as independence, and that sometimes the strongest thing you could do was admit you couldn't fight alone. "Dr. Martinez will be back this afternoon," she told Eli, who was setting up the chessboard for their evening game. "She's bringing a social worker to interview you. What should I tell them?" "The truth, about how you've grown, what you've learned, how you feel about living here." Remy sat down across from him, studying the familiar pattern of the pieces. "But Eli, they're going to ask hard questions. About your mother, about your life before you came here, about whether you've been pressured or coerced in any way. I know what to say." Eli moved his king's pawn forward 2 spaces, a confident opening that still made Remy smile. "I'm not a little kid anymore. I can speak for myself. That night, after the officials had left, after the interviews and inspections and careful documentation, Remy sat by the fire reading the legal papers Michael had overnighted to her. Emergency petition for guardianship. Affidavits from neighbors and community members. Medical reports documenting Eli's improved health and well-being. What are our chances? Eli asked from his spot on the floor, where he was putting the finishing touches on a chess piece, a queen this time, with flowing robes and a crown of delicate points. Honestly, I don't know. Remy set aside the papers and picked up the queen, admiring the detail work. Your mother has legal rights, and Derek Walsh has money and lawyers. That's a powerful combination. But we have something they don't. We have the truth. We have a community willing to stand up for what's right. And we have each other. She handed the chess piece back to him, noting how his hands had grown rougher over the months, calloused from honest work, but steady and sure. Sometimes that's enough. The hearing was scheduled for the following Friday, just 4 days away. 4 days to prepare their case, to gather their witnesses, to make their stand for the family they'd chosen and built together. That night, as Eli climbed to his loft and Remy banked the fire for sleep, she found herself thinking about her grandmother's journal, about the passage that said broken children were gifts sent to teach that healing was possible. She thought about Sarah, about love and loss and the courage required to risk caring again. She thought about Eli, not the angry, frightened boy who'd arrived 5 months ago, but the confident young man he'd become, the son of her heart if not her blood. Outside, the wind sang through the pines with a sound like distant voices, her grandmother's voice, perhaps. I carried on the mountain air to remind her that some battles were worth fighting, regardless of the odds. Some families were worth everything you had to give. The morning would bring new challenges, new obstacles to overcome. But tonight, in the warm circle of firelight, surrounded by the solid walls of the home they'd made together, Remy Cade prepared for the most important fight of her life. The fight for family. The fight for love. The fight for the right to choose who you become and who you become it with. 4 days. And then they'd know whether love was stronger than law, whether chosen family trumped biological obligation, whether a broken woman and a lost boy could create something worth preserving in the face of money and legal maneuvering and societal expectations. 4 days to save everything that mattered. Remy fell asleep that night with her hand on the chess piece Eli had carved, the queen, protector of kings, defender of those she loved. Tomorrow, she'd need to be a queen herself, fierce and strategic and willing to sacrifice everything for the people who mattered most. Tomorrow, the real battle would begin. The courthouse in Cedar Falls was a stern brick building that had presided over the valley's legal affairs for more than a century. Its high windows and imposing columns spoke of justice and permanence, of decisions made with careful deliberation and lasting consequence. But as Remy climbed the worn stone steps with Eli beside her, she felt small and insignificant under its watchful gaze. The court summons crumpled in her jacket pocket seemed to weigh more than the mountains surrounding the valley. Emergency custody hearing. Hendricks vs. Cade. The case that would determine whether the family she and Eli had built together would be allowed to survive. You ready for this? She asked Eli as they paused before the heavy oak doors. He straightened his shoulders, wearing the only dress shirt she'd been able to find in town, too big in the collar, too short in the sleeves, but clean and pressed with care. Over the past 5 months, he'd grown broader through the chest and shoulders. His face had filled out, and there was a steady confidence in his eyes that hadn't been there when his mother first brought him to the mountain. I'm ready, he said simply. Inside, the courtroom was smaller than Remy had expected, with wooden pews like a church and tall windows that let in the pale February light. Judge Michael Chen sat behind an elevated bench, his black robes making him look formal and distant despite their long friendship. He nodded slightly when he saw her, but his expression remained carefully neutral. The courthouse in Cedar Falls was a stern brick building that had presided over the valley's legal affairs for more than a century. Its high windows and imposing columns spoke of justice and permanence, of decisions made with careful deliberation and lasting consequence. But as Remy climbed the worn stone steps with Eli beside her, she felt small and insignificant under its watchful gaze. The court summons, crumpled in her jacket pocket, seemed to weigh more than the mountains surrounding the valley. Emergency custody hearing. Hendricks vs. Cade. The case that would determine whether the family she and Eli had built together would be allowed to survive. "You ready for this?" she asked Eli as they paused before the heavy oak doors. He straightened his shoulders, wearing the only dress shirt she'd been able to find in town, too big in the collar, too short in the sleeves, but clean and pressed with care. Over the past 5 months, he'd grown broader through the chest and shoulders. His face had filled out, and there was a steady confidence in his eyes that hadn't been there when his mother first brought him to the mountain. "I'm ready," he said simply. Inside, the courtroom was smaller than Remy had expected, with wooden pews like a church and tall windows that let in the pale February light. Judge Michael Chen sat behind an elevated bench, his black robes making him look formal and distant despite their long friendship. He nodded slightly when he saw her, but his expression remained carefully neutral. The courthouse in Cedar Falls was a stern brick building that had presided over the valley's legal affairs for more than a century. Its high windows and imposing columns spoke of justice and permanence, of decisions made with careful deliberation and lasting consequence. But as Remy climbed the worn stone steps with Eli beside her, she felt small and insignificant under its watchful gaze. The court summons, crumpled in her jacket pocket, seemed to weigh more than the mountains surrounding the valley. Emergency custody hearing. Hendricks vs. Cade. The case that would determine whether the family she and Eli had built together would be allowed to survive. "You ready for this?" she asked Eli as they paused before the heavy oak doors. He straightened his shoulders, wearing the only dress shirt she'd been able to find in town, too big in the collar, too short in the sleeves, but clean and pressed with care. Over the past 5 months, he'd grown broader through the chest and shoulders. His face had filled out, and there was a steady confidence in his eyes that hadn't been there when his mother first brought him to the mountain. "I'm ready," he said simply. Inside, the courtroom was smaller than Remy had expected, with wooden pews like a church and tall windows that let in the pale February light. Judge Michael Chen sat behind an elevated bench, his black robes making him look formal and distant despite their long friendship. He nodded slightly when he saw her, but his expression remained carefully neutral. Martha Hendricks sat at the plaintiff's table with Derek Walsh and a lawyer in an expensive suit. Martha looked better than she had during her visit to the cabin, cleaner, more put together, but Remy could see the telltale signs of someone fighting a losing battle with addiction. The slight tremor in her hands, the way she kept licking her lips, the darting glances toward the door as if planning an escape route. Derek, by contrast, looked confident and comfortable, his silver hair perfectly styled, his suit tailored to emphasize his success. He leaned over to whisper something to their lawyer, who nodded and made notes on a yellow legal pad. At the defendant's table, Remy's attorney, Rebecca Santos, recommended by Michael and driven up from Denver at considerable expense, was arranging her own papers with brisk efficiency. She was younger than Remy had expected, but her reputation for fighting hopeless cases and winning them was legendary. "Remember," Rebecca had told them during their preparation session, "this isn't about who loves Eli more. It's about what's in his best interests. We need to show that you've provided him with stability, safety, and opportunities for growth that his mother cannot." The gallery behind them was surprisingly full. Jake Morrison sat in the front row, his Sunday suit making him look uncomfortable but determined. Dr. Martinez was there, along with several other Valley residents who'd made the drive to town on icy roads. Even Tom Bradley had come, his arthritis making the courthouse steps a challenge, but his sense of justice making the journey worthwhile. "All rise," the bailiff called, the Honorable Judge Chen presiding. Michael took his seat and surveyed the courtroom with the careful neutrality that had made him one of the most respected family court judges in the state. "This is an emergency hearing in the matter of Hendricks versus Cade, regarding the custody of minor child Eli James Hendricks. Counsel, please state your appearances." The opposing lawyer, Richard Blackwood, according to the business card he'd handed Rebecca, rose first. Your Honor, Richard Blackwood representing plaintiff Martha Hendricks in her petition for immediate return of custody of her minor son. Rebecca stood, her voice clear and confident. Rebecca Santos, representing defendant Remy Cade, who seeks continued guardianship of Eli Hendricks in the best interests of the child. Very well. Judge Chen consulted his papers. Mr. Blackwood, this is your petition. Please proceed. Blackwood was smooth, professional, and utterly ruthless. He painted a picture of a devoted mother who'd temporarily placed her troubled son with a family friend while she sought treatment for her personal problems. He spoke eloquently about Martha's rights as a biological parent, about the fundamental importance of the mother-child bond, about the dangers of allowing well-meaning strangers to interfere with family relationships. Your Honor, he said, his voice carrying just the right note of moral indignation. My client made a difficult decision to seek help for her son when she felt unable to provide the guidance he needed. She placed him temporarily with Ms. Cade, expecting that arrangement to last perhaps a few weeks while she addressed her personal challenges. He gestured toward Martha, who dabbed at her eyes with a tissue. Instead, she finds herself fighting for the return of her own child, battling against someone who has no legal right to keep a boy from his loving mother. Blackwood called Martha to the stand first. She testified tearfully about her love for Eli, about the mistakes she'd made and the steps she'd taken to correct them. She spoke about completing a rehabilitation program, though she was vague about dates and details, and about her relationship with Derek, who she characterized as a stabilizing influence in her life. I never meant for this to be permanent, she said, her voice breaking. I just needed help, and now they won't give me my son back. Under cross-examination, Rebecca was gentle but persistent. She asked about Martha's employment history, spotty at best, about her living situation, a rented room in Derek's house. About her sobriety, Martha claimed 6 weeks clean, but couldn't provide documentation from any treatment program. Miss Hendricks, Rebecca asked, when you brought Eli to Ms. Cade's cabin in September, what exactly did you tell her about the arrangement? I asked her to help him, to teach him discipline. Did you specify a time frame for this help? Martha's eyes darted toward Derek. I thought maybe a few weeks, a month at most. And yet you made no contact with your son for 5 months. No phone calls, no letters, no visits. Why was that? I was getting better. I didn't want him to see me until you discovered that your son had inherited property from his father's estate. Objection, Blackwood called. Relevance. Your Honor, Rebecca replied smoothly. The timing of Miss Hendricks's sudden desire to regain custody is highly relevant to determining her true motivations. I'll allow it, Judge Chen said. Answer the question, Miss Hendricks. Martha's composure cracked slightly. The inheritance has nothing to do with this. I want my son back because he's my son. But you didn't know about the inheritance until recently, did you? In fact, you only learned about it when Mr. Walsh conducted research into your son's background. That's not... Your Honor, Derek Walsh called from the gallery. I object to this line of questioning. I'm not a party to these proceedings, Mr. Walsh, Judge Chen said mildly. You're not an attorney in this case. Please remain silent or I'll have you removed. Derek subsided, but Remy could see the anger in his eyes, the calculation. This wasn't going the way he'd planned. The afternoon session began with Eli's testimony. Remy watched nervously as he took the stand, looking young and vulnerable in the formal setting despite the confidence he'd gained over their months together. Blackwood questioned him first, trying to paint Remy as a controlling figure who'd isolated him from his mother and filled his head with ideas about independence and self-sufficiency. Eli, Blackwood said in a fatherly tone. Do you miss your mother? Yes, sir, I do. And you understand that she loves you and wants you to come home? I understand that's what she says. What do you mean by that? Eli looked directly at Martha, his expression sad but resolute. I mean, my mom has told me she loves me lots of times, usually right before she'd disappear for days, or bring home men who scared me, or spend the grocery money on bottles. Objection, Blackwood called. But Judge Chen overruled him. Son, Blackwood tried again. Isn't it true that Ms. Cade has pressured you to say negative things about your mother? No, sir. Remy's never pressured me to say anything except the truth. When Rebecca questioned Eli, his testimony was clear, thoughtful, and devastating to Martha's case. He spoke about his life before coming to the mountain, the hunger, the fear, the constant uncertainty. He described his transformation under Remy's care, the skills he'd learned, the confidence he'd gained, the sense of safety and belonging he'd found. Eli, Rebecca asked, if you could choose where to live, what would that choice be? I'd choose to stay with Remy, he said without hesitation. She's taught me that I'm worth something, that I have value, that I can take care of myself and contribute to a family instead of just being a burden. And how do you feel about your mother? Eli was quiet for a long moment, his eyes finding Martha's across the courtroom. I love her. I always will. But loving someone and trusting them to take care of you are different things. My mom needs help, more help than I can give her. And I need to be somewhere I can grow into the person I'm supposed to become. As the day wore on, witness after witness testified about the changes in Eli since he'd come to live on the mountain. Dr. Martinez spoke about his improved health and emotional stability. Jake Morrison described his transformation from an angry, defensive boy to a confident young man. Dr. Patricia Reeves, who'd spent several sessions evaluating both Remy and Eli, testified about the healthy attachment they'd formed and Remy's fitness as a guardian. But the most damaging testimony came from Tom Bradley, whose age and reputation in the valley gave his words particular weight. I've lived in this valley for 78 years, he said, his voice creaky but strong. I've seen Martha Hendricks drunk in public more times than I can count. I've seen her crying at Murphy's bar about abandoning her boy, then bragging about the money she's going to inherit. And I've seen Eli Hendricks change from a scared, skinny kid into a fine young man under Remy Cade's care. And in your opinion, Rebecca asked, what would be in Eli's best interests? Staying right where he is, Tom said firmly, with the woman who's treated him like a son instead of a meal ticket. As the court recessed for the day, Remy felt cautiously optimistic. Their case was strong, their witnesses compelling. But she also knew that family law could be unpredictable, that biological parents had rights that were difficult to overcome, and that Derek Walsh was far from finished fighting. The real battle would come tomorrow, when Rebecca presented their formal case for guardianship, and Blackwood made his final push to return Eli to his mother's custody. Everything they'd built together, everything they meant to each other, would be decided by 12 hours of testimony and legal argument. The family they'd chosen was about to face its ultimate test, the manila folder Rebecca Santos placed on the defendant's table the next morning was thick with documents that had arrived by overnight courier from Denver. Medical records, police reports, financial statements, the paper trail of Martha Hendricks' descent into addiction and Derek Walsh's calculated exploitation of her vulnerability. Your Honor, Rebecca began as the second day of hearings commenced. Before we proceed with witness testimony, the defense would like to enter several exhibits into evidence that we believe are crucial to understanding the true nature of this custody petition. Judge Chen reviewed the documents with the careful attention that had made him one of the most respected family court judges in Colorado. His expression remained neutral, but Remy caught the slight tightening around his eyes as he read through the police reports, the involuntary twitch of his jaw as he studied the medical records. Mr. Blackwood, the judge said finally, did your client disclose any of this information during your preparation? Blackwood looked uncomfortable. Your Honor, my client's past struggles with substance abuse are not relevant to her current fitness as a parent. People can change, people can recover. Mr. Blackwood, Judge Chen interrupted, his voice carrying a note of steel. 3 DUI arrests in the past 18 months are absolutely relevant to parental fitness, as are multiple emergency room visits for alcohol poisoning. As are unpaid bills and eviction notices. He held up one of the documents. This medical record is dated 2 weeks ago. It shows a blood alcohol level of 0.28 during an ER visit for intoxication. That's not recovery, counselor. That's active addiction. Derek Walsh shifted in his seat, his confident demeanor beginning to crack. Beside him, Martha was pale and shaking, her hands clenched so tightly in her lap that her knuckles were white. Furthermore, Judge Chen continued, I see no evidence of any completed rehabilitation program, despite testimony yesterday claiming otherwise. What I do see is a pattern of escalating substance abuse coinciding exactly with Mr. Walsh's involvement in Ms. Hendricks' life. Rebecca rose smoothly. Your Honor, the defense would like to call Derek Walsh to the stand. Objection, Blackwood said quickly. Mr. Walsh is not a party to these proceedings. Mr. Walsh has inserted himself into these proceedings by his own actions, Rebecca replied. He accompanied Ms. Hendricks to Ms. Cade's property. He made threats regarding custody, and according to phone records we've subpoenaed, he initiated contact with Child Protective Services multiple times using false allegations. His motivations are absolutely relevant to this case. I'll allow it, Judge Chen ruled. Mr. Walsh, you're required to testify. Derek's lawyer, he'd apparently hired separate counsel overnight, objected strenuously, but the judge's decision stood. Derek took the stand with visible reluctance, his silver hair still perfectly styled, but his composure clearly strained. Under Rebecca's questioning, the truth began to emerge. Derek was a real estate developer who specialized in acquiring undervalued properties from desperate sellers. He'd met Martha at Murphy's Bar 6 months earlier, when she was crying drunkenly about her failures as a mother. It must have been quite a coincidence, Rebecca said with deceptive mildness, meeting a woman whose son had recently inherited valuable property. I had no knowledge of any inheritance when I first met Martha. Derek replied, but his voice lacked conviction. Really? Because we have records showing that you conducted a title search on the Hendricks property 3 days after your first documented contact with Ms. Hendricks. We also have witness testimony that you were asking questions about Eli Hendricks' family background within a week of meeting his mother. Derek's lawyer objected, but the damage was done. Rebecca systematically demolished Derek's pretense of being a concerned boyfriend, trying to help Martha reunite with her son. Phone records showed multiple calls to lawyers specializing in property development. Financial records revealed that Derek had been paying Martha's rent and buying her alcohol while simultaneously pressuring her to regain custody of Eli. Mr. Walsh, Rebecca asked, are you aware that the property Eli inherited includes mineral rights that could be worth millions of dollars if developed? I may have heard something about mineral rights, Derek admitted reluctantly. And are you aware that as Eli's legal guardian, Martha would have control over those mineral rights until he reaches the age of majority? I'm not a lawyer. I don't know the specifics but you are familiar with the concept, aren't you? Familiar enough to have already negotiated a development deal with Excelsior Mining, contingent on obtaining access to the mineral rights. The courtroom erupted. Blackwood objected furiously. Derek's lawyer demanded a recess, and Martha began crying openly, not the calculated tears of the day before, but the raw sobs of someone who'd finally realized how thoroughly she'd been manipulated. Judge Chen gavelled for order, his expression grim. Mr. Walsh, are you currently under contract with a mining company regarding property belonging to Eli Hendricks? Derek's composure finally cracked completely. It's not illegal to explore business opportunities. If the boy inherits property, if his mother gains legal control of it, if she chooses to develop it, if, Rebecca interrupted. But what's not theoretical, Mr. Walsh, is your deliberate manipulation of a vulnerable woman struggling with addiction. What's not theoretical is your use of that manipulation to gain access to a minor child's inheritance. What's not theoretical is your complete disregard for that child's welfare in pursuit of financial gain. The afternoon brought Martha back to the stand, but this time her testimony was very different. Under Rebecca's gentle but persistent questioning, she broke down completely, admitting to the drinking, to the lies, to the ways Derek had convinced her that regaining custody was the only way to prove her love for her son. "I know I'm not fit to be his mother right now," she sobbed. "I know I failed him. But Derek said, if I got Eli back, if I signed the papers for the mining deal, we'd have enough money to get me real help. Good help, and then I could be the mother Eli deserves." "Martha," Rebecca said gently, "do you understand that the only way Mr. Walsh benefits from this arrangement is if you maintain custody long enough to sign away your son's inheritance? He said he loved me. He said he wanted to help. And what do you think would happen to you after the mining contracts were signed? After Mr. Walsh had what he wanted?" Martha's face crumpled as the full scope of her manipulation became clear. "I don't know. I don't know anything anymore." The most devastating moment came when Rebecca asked Martha to look at her son, really look at him, and describe what she saw. He's grown," Martha whispered. "He's stronger, healthier, more confident than I've ever seen him." She wiped her nose with a tissue, her voice breaking. "He looks happy, really happy. And I can't remember the last time I saw him look happy when he was with me. Martha, what do you think is best for Eli? Not what Derek told you, not what you think you should want, but what do you honestly believe is best for your son?" The courtroom was silent as Martha struggled with the question, her face cycling through pain, love, guilt, and finally a kind of desperate honesty. "He should stay with Remy," she said finally. "She's given him something I never could. She's given him a real home, real stability, real love without strings attached." She looked directly at Eli, tears streaming down her face. "I love you, baby. I love you so much, but loving you means wanting what's best for you, even if it breaks my heart." The hearing concluded with closing arguments. Blackwood, his case in shambles, made a half-hearted plea about the sanctity of the mother-child bond. But his heart wasn't in it, and everyone in the courtroom could tell. Rebecca's closing was measured but powerful. She spoke about the transformation they'd all witnessed in Eli, about the stability and love Remy had provided, about the cynical manipulation that had driven this custody challenge. Most importantly, she spoke about what family really meant. "Your Honor," she said, "this case isn't about biology or legal technicalities or even parental rights. It's about a boy who was lost and a woman who helped him find himself. It's about chosen family, the family we build through love and commitment and daily acts of care. It's about understanding that sometimes the greatest act of parental love is recognizing when someone else can provide what you cannot." Judge Chen retired to consider his decision. Leaving the courtroom in tense silence, Remy sat with Eli, holding his hand, both of them afraid to speak, afraid to hope, afraid to imagine what life would be like if they lost. Martha approached them during the recess, her face ravaged by tears and regret. "I'm sorry," she whispered to Eli. "I'm so sorry for everything, for bringing you into this, for the years of chaos, and for almost letting that man destroy the good thing you found." Eli stood and hugged his mother, this broken woman who'd given him life but couldn't give him the life he needed. "I know, Mom, I love you too, but you need to get help, real help. For you, not for anyone else. I will. I promise I will." When Judge Chen returned, his expression was solemn but not unsympathetic. "This case has presented the court with a complex situation involving competing claims to what is undoubtedly a remarkable young man. However, after careful consideration of all testimony and evidence, the court's decision is guided by one principle above all others: the best interests of the child." He looked at Martha, his voice gentle but firm. "Ms. Hendricks, it's clear that you love your son. It's equally clear that you are currently unable to provide him with the stability, safety, and nurturing environment he requires. Your struggles with addiction, your involvement with Mr. Walsh, and your own testimony all support this conclusion." Then he turned to Remy, and his expression warmed slightly. "Miss Cade, you have provided extraordinary care for this young man. The evidence shows dramatic improvement in his physical health, emotional well-being, and personal development under your guardianship. More importantly, you have given him something invaluable, the knowledge that he is worthy of love and capable of great things. Therefore, the court awards permanent guardianship of Eli James Hendricks to Remy Cade, with all rights and responsibilities thereof. Furthermore, the court orders that Ms. Hendricks' parental rights be temporarily suspended pending successful completion of a court-approved rehabilitation program, at which time a review of visitation privileges may be considered. The courtroom erupted in quiet celebration. Jake Morrison's weathered face split into a huge grin. Dr. Martinez nodded approvingly. Even Tom Bradley, despite his arthritis, managed a small fist pump. But the most important moment was the quiet one, Remy and Eli looking at each other, realizing that the family they'd chosen had been legally recognized, that the bond they'd forged was now protected by law. They were home. They were family. They were safe. The battle was over and love had won. The hand-carved wooden sign swayed gently in the mountain breeze. Its letters burned deep into weathered pine. Cade and Thompson Ranch, wilderness skills and youth mentoring. Eli stepped back to admire his handiwork, the late September sun warm on his back as he adjusted the chains that would hold it securely to the gatepost. "Thompson," Remy asked, though she was smiling as she said it. "Well, I had to pick a last name for the legal documents," Eli replied, securing the final chain link. "And I figured Thompson was my dad's name, but you're the one who taught me what it means to be a man. So maybe I could honor both." It had been 18 months since the custody hearing, 18 months of building something new from the foundation they'd established during those first crucial months together. The legal guardianship had given them security, but it was the daily choices, to trust, to grow, to face challenges together, that had turned their arrangement into a true family. The cabin had grown too, expanded with a second bedroom, a larger kitchen, and a workshop where Eli could pursue his woodworking. More importantly, they'd built a program that attracted troubled youth from across the region, boys and girls who arrived angry, lost or broken and left with skills, confidence, and a sense of their own worth. "Remember the first kid we took in?" Remy asked, watching Eli make final adjustments to their sign. "Marcus, 15 years old, arrested 3 times for shoplifting, convinced the whole world was against him." Eli grinned at the memory. "Now he's at Colorado State studying forestry management. Sends us postcards from his internship with the National Park Service." Their first student had arrived 6 months after the custody hearing, referred by Dr. Martinez as an alternative to juvenile detention. Marcus Williams had been everything Eli had once been: defiant, frightened, certain that any adult offering help had an ulterior motive. It had taken weeks of patience, consistency, and the kind of tough love that demanded excellence while offering unconditional support. "And Sarah Beth," Remy added, referring to the 16-year-old girl who'd spent last summer with them after aging out of her 3rd foster home. Got her GED, learned to hunt and fish, went back to her home state ready to tackle community college. The program had grown organically, funded partly by the state's alternative education initiatives and partly by Eli's inheritance. The mining rights that Derek Walsh had tried to steal turned out to be worth far more than anyone had imagined. But Eli had chosen to develop them responsibly, using the income to support their work with at-risk youth. Martha had kept her promise. After the hearing, she'd entered a 90-day residential treatment program, followed by 6 months in a sober living facility. She'd been clean for over a year now, working as a counselor at the same rehab center where she'd gotten help. Her visits to the mountain were regular but respectful. She understood that while she would always be Eli's biological mother, Remy was his parent in every way that mattered. "She's proud of you. You know," Remy said as they walked back toward the expanded cabin. "Your mom. Last time she visited, she spent an hour telling me about your acceptance letter to the forestry program." Eli nodded, his expression thoughtful. At 18, he was legally an adult, free to make his own choices about his future. He'd been accepted to several excellent colleges, but had chosen to defer enrollment for a year to help establish their mentoring program on solid footing. "I want to go to college," he said, "but I also want to make sure this place, what we've built here, continues to exist for other kids who need it." "It will exist," Remy assured him, "whether you're here full-time or not. We've got Jake Morrison's grandson interested in helping out, and Dr. Martinez has been talking about early retirement and maybe spending some time teaching wilderness medicine up here." They'd reached the cabin, where the sounds of their current group could be heard from the workshop behind the main building. 3 teenagers, 2 boys and a girl, who'd arrived at different times over the summer, each carrying their own burdens, each slowly learning that they were capable of more than they'd ever imagined. "Evening chores," Eli said, checking his watch. "Want to help me get them organized?" "Actually," Remy said, "I thought tonight might be a good time for you to run the program solo. Consider it practice for when you're off at college, and I'm handling things here on my own." They both knew it wasn't really about practice. It was about recognition, acknowledgement that the frightened, angry boy who'd arrived 3 years ago had become a man capable of leading, teaching, and inspiring others. The student had become the teacher, the rescued had become the rescuer. As Eli headed toward the workshop to gather his charges for evening chores, Remy walked to the edge of the meadow where she'd built a small memorial garden for Sarah. The stone marker was simple, just her daughter's name, dates and the words, "Forever loved, never forgotten." But the garden around it was alive with wildflowers and native plants, a living testament to beauty that could grow from even the deepest grief. "Look what he's become," she said quietly to the stone, as she did every evening. "Look what we built together." The sound of young voices drifted across the meadow, Eli explaining the proper way to split kindling, demonstrating the technique with patience and gentle correction when one of the kids struggled with the unfamiliar task. His voice had deepened over the years, carrying the authority of someone who'd learned through experience, who'd earned the right to teach through his own willingness to learn. As the sun touched the western peaks, painting the sky in shades of gold and rose, Remy thought about circles, how life moved in great, mysterious circles that brought us back to where we started, but at a deeper level of understanding. She'd come to this mountain broken and alone, convinced she was too damaged to love anyone again. Now she was surrounded by the evidence of love's power to heal, to transform, to create family from the most unlikely materials. The dinner bell rang, Eli's signal that evening chores were complete, and it was time for their daily family meal. Remy walked back toward the cabin, where warm light spilled from windows and young voices mixed in comfortable conversation. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new students, new opportunities to demonstrate that with patience, consistency, and love, even the most broken spirits could learn to soar. But tonight, there was this, a table full of young people learning that they mattered, that they had value, that they were capable of great things. A son, not of her body but of her heart, who'd grown from victim to victor, from lost to found, from broken to whole. Tonight, there was family. Tonight, there was home. As Remy climbed the steps to the cabin, she could hear Eli telling their current group of kids about proper chess strategy, his voice patient and encouraging as he guided them through the same lessons she'd once taught him. The old chess set sat in the center of the dining table, its carved pieces worn smooth by decades of handling, its boards witness to countless games, countless lessons, countless moments of connection between teacher and student, parent and child, heart and heart. "The thing about chess," Eli was explaining to a sullen 14-year-old who'd arrived just last week, "is that every piece matters. Even the pawns, especially the pawns. They might look small and unimportant, but with the right moves, with patience and strategy, a pawn can become the most powerful piece on the board." The boy, Tommy, his name was another angry kid from a broken home, looked skeptical. But he was listening, engaged despite himself, and Remy could see the first cracks in the wall he'd built around his heart. "Really?" Tommy asked. "A pawn can become a queen?" "If it makes it to the other side of the board," Eli confirmed. But it takes time and patience and a willingness to keep moving forward even when the way looks impossible. Like life, Remy thought, settling into her chair at the head of the table. Like love, like family, like the journey that had brought them all together in this place. At this moment, sharing this meal and these stories, and this quiet miracle of connection, the boy who'd been traded for 2 goats and a sack of grain had become a young man, worth more than all the mineral rights and property deeds in the world. The woman who'd thought she was too broken to love again had discovered that healing and loving often happened simultaneously, each making the other possible, and somewhere on the mountain wind carried on the voices of the pines and the memory of ancient wisdom. Remy could swear she heard her grandmother's approval, her daughter's laughter, the sound of all the spirits who'd touched their lives whispering the same truth. Love finds a way. Family finds a way. Hope, however fragile, however unlikely, always finds a way. The mountain woman and her chosen son sat down to dinner with their extended family of wounded healers and healing wounded. Ready to face whatever tomorrow might bring, they were home,